Richard Sterling did not raise his voice. He never had to. He sat behind his mahogany desk on the 43rd floor, hands folded, and looked at the young woman across from him the way a man looks at something he intends to remove from his path. Claire Bennett was 23 years old, 3 months pregnant, and shaking so badly she had to grip the armrest to keep still. "You will take this," Richard said, sliding an envelope across the desk, "and you will disappear. My son has a future that does not include you or whatever problem you're carrying." She didn't take the envelope. He had her escorted out anyway. If this story already has you feeling something, drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in fast off the Atlantic, the way storms do on that stretch of the Maine coast. No particular warning, just a darkening on the horizon, and then suddenly the wind was throwing sand sideways, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. By the time Ethan Sterling realized he'd misjudged the weather, he was already a quarter-mile from his rental car on the old coastal road with no jacket and nowhere to go. He ran. Not the kind of running a man does in a gym, the desperate, undignified kind. Head down, water sheeting off his hair and into his eyes, shoes already soaked through. He turned up the first road that looked like it might lead somewhere, and found himself at the bottom of a short hill with a lit window at the top of it. A hand-painted sign swinging in the wind that said, simply, "The Blue Door Café." He took the steps 2 at a time and pushed inside. The warmth hit him first. Then the smell. Coffee. Something baked with cinnamon. The faint salt and wood smell of an old building that had stood near the ocean long enough to absorb it. 3 tables were occupied. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead despite the cold. An old radio on the counter was playing something with a piano in it, low enough that you had to stop and listen to catch it. Ethan stood in the doorway, dripping on the welcome mat, catching his breath. A woman came out from the back carrying 2 plates, and she stopped when she saw him. The plates didn't drop. Her face didn't change, but she went very still in the way a person goes still when their body understands something a half second before their mind catches up. She was 31 or 32, dark hair pulled back with a pencil still stuck through it, wearing a blue apron over a gray sweater. She was pretty in a way that had nothing to do with effort, the kind of face that got more specific and interesting the longer you looked at it. Ethan didn't recognize her immediately. He was cold and wet, and his brain was still catching up from the run. He pushed his hair back from his forehead and offered the room a vague, apologetic half-smile. "I'm sorry," he said. "The storm came out of nowhere. I just need to wait it out if that's okay." "Sit wherever," the woman said. Her voice was flat. Not unfriendly, exactly. Careful. He chose a table near the window and pulled off his soaked jacket, draping it over the chair back. A teenage girl with a notepad came and took his order. Black coffee, whatever the soup was today. He pulled out his phone and found, predictably, that he had 2 bars of signal and 17 unanswered messages. Claude's response was interrupted. The coffee went cold while Ethan sat there. He didn't notice. He was still holding his phone, but he'd stopped looking at it somewhere around the 3rd message from his assistant, because his eyes kept moving back to the kitchen door without his permission. The little girl, Lily, had been taken back there by the teenager after what happened, and he could hear, very faintly, the low murmur of Claire's voice, doing what mothers do when they're trying to calm a child down without letting the child know they themselves are not calm. The other customers had gone back to their meals with the particular focused discretion of people who saw something they didn't mean to see. The old man by the window had returned to his newspaper. The couple near the door were talking again, quietly. Normal sounds. Normal life continuing. Ethan sat in the middle of it and felt like the floor had developed a slow tilt he couldn't correct for. "Are you my daddy?" 4 words. A 4-year-old's honest, uncomplicated question, asked the way children ask things, without armor, without calculation, with just the plain need to know. And the way she'd looked at him when she said it, head tipped slightly to one side, eyes serious and brown and so familiar it made his back teeth ache. He needed to not think about the eyes. He picked up the coffee cup, realized it was cold, and put it back down. Claire came out of the kitchen alone. She'd taken off the apron. She walked to his table without hurrying and sat down across from him in the chair she hadn't been invited to, and she put both hands flat on the table, and she looked at him. "She's fine," Claire said. "She gets worked up. She'll have a snack and forget the whole thing, In 10 minutes. Okay, Ethan said. Then, because there wasn't really anything else to say, she won't, though, will she? Claire looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the storm threw a fist of rain against the window. No, she said. She won't. Ethan set his phone face down on the table. Claire. Don't. Her voice didn't rise. It just closed, like a door. Don't say my name like we just ran into each other at a party. Don't do whatever thing you're already rehearsing in your head right now. I'm not rehearsing anything. You're a CEO, Ethan. You rehearse everything. That landed. He absorbed it without flinching because she wasn't wrong. He ran his hand across the back of his neck and looked at the table and then back at her. Is she mine? He said. It wasn't really a question. They both knew that. But he needed her to say it out loud, needed to hear it stated plainly in this small, warm room with the rain coming down outside, because otherwise some part of him would spend the next decade finding ways to doubt it. Claire's jaw tightened. Yes. One word, one syllable. And the whole shape of Ethan Sterling's life rearranged itself quietly, without fanfare, the way massive things sometimes move. Not with a crash, but with a slow, irrevocable shift, like tectonic plates deciding to go a different direction. He breathed out. How old? He said. 4. She'll be 5 in March. He did the math without wanting to. He couldn't stop himself from doing it. 5 years. She would have been pregnant when... And then he stopped, because the math led somewhere he wasn't ready to go yet. A specific point in time. A specific absence. I didn't know it, he said. Something moved across Claire's face. Not softness. Something older and harder than softness. I know you didn't know. That's not the same as it not happening. Claire, I tried to reach you. Her voice was still controlled, but there was weight in it now, the kind of weight that accumulates over years of carrying something alone. 3 times. I wrote to your personal email, the one you gave me. I called the number you'd had since college. I left a message with your office once, which I'm sure never got to you, but I tried. She looked down at her hands, then back up. And then I stopped. Because after a while it became clear that the message was just the message, you know? Whether it got through or not. I wasn't welcome. I was on my own. Ethan stared at her. I never got anything. Not one message. Claire, I swear to you. I'm not asking you to swear anything. I'm telling you, nothing came through. Not the emails, not the calls. I never got any of it. He could hear himself and knew how it sounded, how convenient it was, how perfectly constructed to let him off the hook. And he hated that he couldn't say it differently because it happened to be the truth. Something happened. Someone made sure I didn't get them. Claire went very quiet. The rain eased slightly outside, then surged again. The ceiling fan turned. Your father, she said. It wasn't a question either. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Claire let out a long breath through her nose. She looked out the window at the street where the storm was still doing its damage, and she had the expression of someone confirming something they'd suspected long ago, but had worked hard not to believe because believing it made everything worse instead of better. I sat in that office, she said. He offered me money. A lot of money. I didn't take it. I walked out. She paused. I always assumed he found another way. I just didn't let myself think about it too hard because... She stopped. Because if you thought about it, you'd have to decide whether to be angry at me or at him. Because if I thought about it, she said evenly, it wouldn't change anything. I still would have been alone. Lily still would have needed feeding, and she still wouldn't have had a father, regardless of whose fault it was. That sentence cut clean through to something. Ethan didn't move. He'd been in boardrooms with some of the most aggressive people in American business. He'd negotiated deals that other people walked away from shaking. He was genuinely good at pressure, genuinely good at keeping himself intact when things got difficult. But something about sitting across from Claire Bennett in this small cafe on this stormy evening, listening to her talk about feeding a baby alone, demolished something he hadn't known he was relying on. I'm sorry, he said. Ethan. I know that's not... I know you're sorry. She said it without cruelty and without comfort, just plainly, like a fact. I've thought about this moment, some version of it, for 4 years. And in most of those versions, I had a lot more to say, but sitting here right now, I mostly just feel tired. She looked at him. I don't want to do this tonight. Lily's already unsettled. The storm isn't letting up. I need to close and get her home. Tell me how, he said. Tell me what I have to do. I don't know yet. She stood up. But you could start by paying for the coffee. He found a room at the only inn in town, a converted Victorian 3 blocks from the water that smelled like cedar and old wood, and was run by a woman in her 70s named Dot, who told him, unprompted, that she'd lived in Caldwell Cove for 46 years and could tell him anything he needed to know about it. He took a room on the 2nd floor, hung his jacket over the radiator, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. He thought about Lily's face. He thought about the particular way she'd walked up to him. Not rushing, just certain, the way children are certain when they're operating on instinct they don't yet have words for. She'd looked at him with those dark eyes and asked her question, and now he couldn't stop the cascade of things that came after it. The image of Claire at 23, sitting across from his father, alone in some apartment somewhere, reading the silence from Ethan's end, waiting for a response that never came. A pregnancy. A decision made without him, or rather, made without the version of him that should have been there. His father had done this. He'd known his father was capable of it. Richard Sterling was a man who genuinely believed he was doing the right thing when he dismantled other people's choices. Genuinely believed that his vision of what Ethan's life should look like was a form of love. That was what made it so hard to fight. He wasn't malicious in the conventional sense. He was simply certain in a way that made no room for anyone else's certainty, and he'd spent 30 years building a company and a family around that certainty, and most of the time it had worked well enough that nobody could argue with the results. But Claire had been 23 and pregnant, and she had gone to his father looking for what? A human response. Some acknowledgement that her situation was real and mattered, and Richard Sterling had slid an envelope across his mahogany desk and told her to disappear. And she had. Not because she took the money, but because she was 23 years old and pregnant, and she had understood sitting in that office that the wall in front of her was not something she could go through or over or around. So she had gone sideways. She had come to this small town on this stretch of Maine coast, and she had built something quiet and hers. And she had raised a daughter alone. And the daughter had brown eyes and dark hair, and she walked straight up to strangers with absolute certainty and asked them honest questions. Ethan picked up his phone and called his father. It rang 4 times, then, "Ethan, it's nearly 10 o'clock. I know what time it is." A pause. Richard Sterling was 71 years old and still slept in a full suit, metaphorically speaking. Still held himself with the posture of a man conducting a meeting even in private moments. "Is something wrong?" "I'm in Caldwell Cove," Ethan said. "Maine." Silence. "I had to take shelter from a storm," Ethan continued, "in a cafe on the waterfront, and a little girl walked up to me and asked if I was her father." He kept his voice level. This was deliberate. He didn't want to have the version of this conversation where his father could retreat behind Ethan's emotion and claim the high ground. "Her name is Lily. She's 4 years old. Her mother's name is Claire Bennett." Another silence. Longer this time. "Ethan, I'm not calling to fight," Ethan said. "I want you to know that I know. I want you to hear me say it. Whatever you did, however many things you made sure didn't reach me, I know. And I'm going to deal with that, but not tonight. What you need to understand," his father started, "is that at the time I said not tonight." His voice was still quiet. "Good night, Dad." He hung up. He sat in the dark a while longer. Then he called his assistant, moved his week, and went to sleep in his clothes on top of the covers because he was too tired to do anything else. Claire, at that same hour, was sitting on the floor of Lily's bedroom. This wasn't unusual. She sometimes sat here after Lily went down, in the strip of light that came in from the hallway, just listening to her daughter breathe. People who didn't have children probably found this strange. She didn't care. Lily slept on her stomach with her arms splayed out like she was falling, and the sound of her breathing, even and steady and completely untroubled, was one of the few things in Claire's life that could slow down the noise in her head. Tonight the noise was considerable. She hadn't handled it well. She knew that. She had handled it in the only way available to her, which was to get through it intact, to say the necessary things and hold herself together until Lily was settled. But she had not handled it the way she'd told herself she would if this day ever came. In the scenarios she had constructed over the years, and there had been many, built late at night when she couldn't sleep, she had been cooler, steadier, less visibly shaken. She had said important things clearly and without emotion. She had been impressive. Instead, she had told him she felt tired, which was true, but not the whole truth, and she hated that it was the first real thing that came out of her. She pulled her knees up to her chest and looked at Lily. 4 years and 3 months ago, she had been in a hospital room 2 states away from anyone she knew well, and a nurse had put a squalling, red-faced, furious infant on her chest, and Claire had looked down at her and had the clear, complete, overwhelming feeling that she had never before understood what the word real meant. Everything before that moment had been some approximation. This was real. This was the only thing she'd ever held that couldn't be taken from her. She had named her Lily because her grandmother had grown them. Simple reason. She hadn't tried to make it meaningful. She thought about Ethan's face when she'd told him, the way he'd done the math she'd watched him do, the way something behind his eyes had shifted in that slow-moving way that meant something genuinely unexpected was happening inside a person who was usually very good at being prepared for things. She had expected in some versions of this imagined meeting that he would be defensive, or aggressive, or smooth in that executive way. The careful management of reactions, the PR-trained composure. He hadn't been any of those things. He just looked like a man who'd been hit by something he couldn't see coming and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. There was a version of her. The version that existed at 23, in love and sure, and completely unprepared for how efficiently a man like Richard Sterling could dismantle certainty. That would have found something hopeful in tonight. That version of her had believed, without quite knowing she believed it, that love was something that reasserted itself once the obstacles were removed. That if you could just get past the interference, past the powerful people, and the money and the silence, something true would be waiting on the other side. She wasn't 23 anymore. She didn't know what was on the other side. She didn't know what Ethan wanted, beyond the obvious fact that something had turned over in him tonight that wouldn't turn back. She didn't know how Lily would process this, or what she was supposed to say to a 4-year-old about the man at the cafe. She didn't know how to protect Lily from getting attached to someone who might leave, while also not being the reason Lily never got a chance at having a father. She didn't know anything except that her daughter was breathing and that in 12 hours she had to open the cafe, and that the storm was still going outside the window, and that tomorrow was going to be complicated in ways she couldn't fully map yet. She got up off the floor quietly and went to bed. Ethan came back to the cafe the next morning. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. Some version of a plan, maybe. Something that made sense as an approach. What he had instead was a paper cup of bad coffee from a gas station down the road because he'd woken up early and needed to do something with his hands. And he stood outside the blue door at 7:45 in the thin October morning light and looked at the sign and thought about what he was going to say. He had nothing. He went in anyway. Claire was behind the counter. She saw him come in and she stopped wiping the espresso machine and just looked at him, and he could see her deciding in real time what kind of morning this was going to be. "You're still here," she said. "I moved my week." She looked at him for a moment. That's a very Ethan Sterling thing to say, as if the week is something you move. It is, though, technically. Technically. She turned back to the machine. "Coffee?" "Please." She made it without asking how he took it. Black, which he noted. She put it on the counter, and he sat on one of the stools and wrapped his hands around the mug, and they stayed like that for a moment, the morning quiet around them, the first light coming in gold through the front windows. "She asked about you this morning," Claire said, not looking at him. "Lily. She asked if the man from the cafe was going to come back." Ethan kept very still. "What did you tell her?" "I said I didn't know yet." She finally turned around and leaned back against the counter with her arms crossed, not defensive but thoughtful, like someone working through a problem out loud. "I need you to understand something. She is 4 years old. She is curious and smart, and she has very big feelings, and she doesn't have a filter. If you come into her life and then you leave, for any reason, including reasons that are perfectly understandable from where you're standing. That's not something she'll just get over. Kids don't work that way. She'll carry it. I understand. I don't think you do yet. I think you do, which is different. She said it without meanness. You've been in this situation for roughly 12 hours. You haven't slept. You're running on something that feels like urgency right now, and I get that. I genuinely do. But urgency isn't commitment. I need to know you know the difference. He looked at her across the counter. The morning light was doing something warm to the cafe that the stormy dark of the night before hadn't allowed, and he was struck again, more quietly this time, without the shock of first recognition, by how much she had become someone he didn't fully know anymore. Same face, same particular quality of direct attention that had undone him at 22 in a campus library when she'd looked up from her book and asked him why he kept walking past her table. But someone had built themselves around those things in the 5 years since he'd last seen her, and that person was harder and more competent and much more careful than the girl he'd known. He respected it. He also knew he hadn't earned the right to say so. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I know that sounds like urgency. I can't help that. But I'm telling you, whatever it takes, whatever you need me to do to prove that it's not just urgency, I'll do it. He paused. I don't have a right to ask you to believe that on the strength of one night. I know I don't. But I'm asking anyway. Claire looked at him for a long time. Outside, someone walked past the window with a dog on a leash, the dog stopping to investigate something in the doorway of the shop next door. A perfectly ordinary Caldwell Cove morning, proceeding without reference to the weight of what was being decided inside this room. She gets up at 7, Claire said finally. She has a specific thing she likes to eat for breakfast, which is toast with butter and then jam applied separately, not together, because she doesn't like the way they mix. She has opinions about everything. She has never in her life gone to sleep easily, and she always wants one more story. She uncrossed her arms. If you're staying, those are the things you need to know. Toast with butter, Ethan said. Jam separate. If you mix them, she'll know. I won't mix them. Claire nodded, once, the way she had the night before when she'd confirmed what he already suspected. Not warmly, not with relief, but with the careful, deliberate movement of someone placing one foot in front of the other on uncertain ground. She'll be down in about an hour, Claire said. If you want, you can be here. He wanted. He ordered breakfast, and he waited. And 1 hour and 4 minutes later, the small door at the back of the cafe opened and Lily came through it in mismatched socks, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear, still half asleep, and she stopped when she saw Ethan at the counter. She looked at him. He looked at her. You came back, she said. I came back, he said. She climbed up onto the stool next to him, settled the rabbit in her lap, and looked at him with the frank, unhurried assessment of a 4-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. Then she pointed at his coffee mug. That's not mine, she said. Mine has a duck on it. I'll remember that, he said. She nodded, satisfied, and turned to look for her mother, and Ethan sat very still next to his daughter for the first time in her 4 years of life and tried to remember how to breathe. He stayed 2 weeks before anyone in Caldwell Cove stopped noticing him. That was how small towns worked. A new face got cataloged fast, especially one that showed up at the same cafe every morning and didn't have an obvious reason for being there. Dot, the innkeeper, asked him on day 3 if he was a writer. He said no. She said he had the look of someone who was thinking too hard about something, which in her experience was either a writer or a man with trouble at home. He said it was complicated. She said most things were, and brought him extra towels without being asked. By the end of the first week, he had a standing order at the Blue Door. Coffee, wheat toast, and whatever Claire had put on the breakfast menu that morning. He had learned that Lily took exactly 11 minutes to eat anything, regardless of what it was, because she talked constantly while she ate and couldn't manage both things efficiently. He had learned that she had strong opinions about clouds, which shapes were acceptable and which were, in her word, wrong, and that her stuffed rabbit's name was Gerald, and that Gerald had a complicated backstory involving a prior owner who had, apparently, not deserved him. He had not pushed. He had not tried to accelerate anything. He had simply shown up every morning and let Lily set the pace, which she did with complete confidence because she didn't yet know there was supposed to be anything complicated about it. Claire watched all of this from a careful distance that was not quite warmth and not quite coldness, but something in between, a provisional wait-and-see quality that he understood and didn't push against. She was polite. She let him be there. Occasionally, when Lily said something particularly unexpected, their eyes would meet over her head and share the involuntary parental reflex of suppressed laughter. And those moments were the ones that cost him the most to receive quietly without letting on what they meant to him. He was doing his job remotely. His assistant had become accustomed to calls at unusual hours. His board had questions he was deflecting. And his father had called 4 times, leaving messages that started terse and became, by the 4th one, something closer to uncertain, which was, for Richard Sterling, the equivalent of another man getting down on his knees. Ethan hadn't called back yet. He wasn't ready. He needed to get the shape of things clear in his own mind before he let his father's voice into it. On day 9, something shifted. It happened quietly, the way the real things did. He had arrived at the cafe at his usual time to find Claire already in the middle of a situation. The teenager who helped on weekday mornings, a girl named Maya, had called in sick, and the cafe had a private booking at 10 for a retirement luncheon that Claire had been planning for 2 weeks, and she was simultaneously trying to prep the food, manage the counter, and keep Lily occupied, and it was visibly not working. Ethan walked in, read the room in about 4 seconds, took off his jacket and said, "What do you need me to do?" Claire looked at him. "You don't have to. What do you need me to do?" A beat. Then, "The tables in the back need to be set for 12. Napkins are in the drawer under the register. Plates are on the 3rd shelf. Lily will tell you if you're doing it wrong." "I'll do it wrong on purpose so she has something to correct," he said. The corner of Claire's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. "She'll see through that in about 30 seconds. "I know, but she'll enjoy the 30 seconds. He set the tables. Lily supervised with great seriousness, rearranging things he'd placed slightly imperfectly and explaining to him at length why forks went where they went, which she had apparently decided based on a logic system entirely her own. He let her. He asked questions. She answered them with the patient condescension of someone who had been doing this much longer than him, which, in her understanding of time, she had. The luncheon ran smoothly. Claire handled the food. Ethan managed the drinks, cleared plates when needed, refilled water without being asked, and stayed out of the way of the things she had under control. Afterward, when the guests had gone and Lily was napping in the back and the cafe was quiet, Claire stood at the sink washing a bowl and said, without turning around, "You didn't have to do that." "I know. You're a CEO. You don't... clearing tables isn't exactly..." "Claire." He was leaning against the counter with a dish towel in his hand. "I cleared tables in a dining hall for 2 years in college. It's not beneath me." She turned around. "I know it's not beneath you. That's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" She looked at him for a moment. There was something working behind her expression that she hadn't decided yet whether to say out loud. "I mean, it was good of you," she said finally. "That's all. It was good of you." It wasn't much. He knew that, but it was the first thing she had said to him in 9 days that didn't have the careful buffer of distance around it, and he took it for what it was and didn't try to make it into more. "The forks really do go on the left," he said. "I just want you to know I was aware of that the whole time." "I know you were," she said. She enjoyed herself anyway. She really did. This time it was a real smile. Brief and then gone, like light through a passing gap in clouds, but real. The call from his father came on day 12, and this time Ethan picked up. He was sitting on the dock at the end of the main road, the one that reached out into the cove and had a bench at the end of it, where someone had carved initials into the wood so long ago the letters had gone soft with weather. He'd started coming here in the evenings when the cafe was closed and Lily was in bed because the water helped him think, and there was nowhere else to go in a town this size that felt like it was meant for sitting. "Ethan," his father said. "Dad." A pause. Richard Sterling was not a man who paused. The pause itself communicated something. "I've been doing some thinking." "Good." "I want to..." Another pause, shorter. I want to explain some things, if you're willing to hear them. I'll hear them, Ethan said, but I need you to understand before you start that explaining isn't the same as it being okay. I just want you to know I know the difference. He'd used Claire's words without meaning to. He noticed it after they were out. His father took a breath. When Claire came to me, he began, you were 26. You had just been given the interim CEO position. The board was watching everything. You'd worked for 10 years for that. We had worked for 10 years. She was a girl who wasn't part of our world, Ethan. And she was pregnant. And I thought you knew better. Yes. Richard's voice was quiet. I thought I knew what was best for you. I have spent your entire life believing that, and most of the time I had enough results to feel justified. But this... He stopped. I didn't know about the child. I didn't know she was going to leave and raise a child alone. I blocked the messages, yes. I told my assistant to intercept anything from her number. I thought she would take the money eventually, and the problem would resolve. She wasn't a problem. I know that. She was 23 years old and pregnant, and she came to you for help. I know what she was. His father's voice cracked almost imperceptibly on the last word. For Richard Sterling, that hairline fracture was the equivalent of a collapse. I've known it for some time. I didn't let myself sit with it fully, because sitting with it fully meant sitting with what I'd done, and I am not... He stopped again. I'm not good at that, Ethan. I never have been. Ethan stared at the water. Her name is Lily, he said. She's 4. She has your mother's eyes, I think, the shape of them. Silence. I'd like to meet her, Richard said, and his voice was something Ethan had never heard from him before. Tentative, raw at the edges, like something that had been kept sealed for a long time and was finally open to the air. That's not my decision, Ethan said. That's Claire's. I know. I'll ask her. I'm not going to promise her anything except that you're asking. What she decides is hers. That's fair, his father said. Yes, that's fair. They didn't say much after that. But when Ethan ended the call and sat for a while longer on the bench at the end of the dock, something in the weight he'd been carrying since that first night rearranged itself slightly. Not resolved, just shifted. The way a physical thing shifts when you've been holding it long enough that your arms adjust. He had been in Caldwell Cove for 3 weeks when Lily got sick. It started as a cough, the ordinary kind, a child's seasonal cold, unremarkable. Claire mentioned it casually on a Thursday morning, the way parents mention these things when they've seen enough of them to know they usually amount to nothing. By Thursday evening, the cough had a rattle in it. By Friday morning, Lily had a fever of 101, and Claire had moved the cafe's Saturday hours to half-day, and was watching Lily with the particular quality of maternal attention that looks calm on the outside and is anything but. Ethan was not a parent who had grown into this gradually. He was a man learning to be a parent in real time, with no reference points, and the first time he saw Lily listless, she who was never still, never quiet, who could fill a room with the force of her attention and her opinions about cloud shapes, something in him went very cold and very sharp. She seems worse than yesterday, he said to Claire on Friday afternoon. He'd come by after she'd texted him that Lily wasn't improving. She does, Claire said. She was sitting on the edge of Lily's bed with a cool cloth. I'm watching the fever. If it goes higher... What's higher? 103 is when I call the doctor. And the nearest hospital? 40 minutes. Barton General. She looked at him. Ethan, children get fevers. She's had them before. I know. You're doing the thing where you're already planning 6 steps ahead. I'm not... He stopped. Yes, I am. I know. I'll stop. He didn't stop, but he sat in the small armchair in the corner of Lily's room, and he stayed there, and Claire stayed on the edge of the bed, and they kept a kind of watch together that didn't require conversation, which was its own strange intimacy. The shared vigil of 2 people who were both fixed on the same small sleeping face and the same slow digital readout of the thermometer on the nightstand. At 11:15 Friday night, the fever hit 103. At 11:16, Claire was on the phone with the after-hours nurse line. At 11:22, with the nurse recommending an immediate in-person evaluation, Ethan had already gotten the car. The storm that rolled in that night was not as dramatic as the one that had first sent him into the blue door, but it was mean. A hard driving rain with no let-up, the road slick and dark, the curves on the coastal highway that connected Caldwell Cove to Barton unmarked and unlit at those hours. Claire sat in the back with Lily, who was awake now and frightened and running hot and feverish clingy in the way sick children are, and Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel and the focused, deliberate care of someone who understood that this 40 minutes was the most important drive he had ever taken. He didn't speed recklessly. That was the thing Claire remembered later, that he didn't panic in the visible, reckless way. He drove fast but controlled, smoothly through the curves, talking low and steady to the road as if it could hear him, and occasionally he would catch her eyes in the rear view and say something brief and even. 15 more minutes. She's okay. I've got it. And she didn't know exactly when she started to believe those things, but somewhere between the halfway mark and the lights of Barton appearing through the rain, she did. They were in the ER by midnight. Lily had what turned out to be a significant respiratory infection. Not pneumonia, not yet, but close enough to the edge of it that the attending physician put her on IV antibiotics and wanted to observe her through the weekend. She would be fine. She was going to be fine. Claire heard this and sat down in one of the plastic chairs in the hallway outside Lily's room and put her face in her hands and stayed there for a moment, doing the private reckoning that parents do when the crisis resolves, and all the controlled fear that kept them functional during it suddenly has nowhere to go. Ethan sat down next to her. He didn't say anything. He didn't put his arm around her or tell her it was okay or do any of the things that would have been the obvious gesture. He just sat next to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and let her have the moment without feeling it. After a while, she lifted her face from her hands. "She's going to be fine," she said, saying it out loud for herself, not for him. "She's going to be fine," he agreed. They sat in silence in that hallway for another few minutes. Down the corridor, a cart went by. Someone was laughing at the nurse's station, a brief, ordinary sound. The overhead lights hummed the way hospital lights do. "You drove well," Claire said. "I know those roads," he said. "I've been driving them for 3 weeks." "You were calm." "I was terrified," he said. "I'm extremely good at being terrified quietly." She looked at him. Something in his face, the exhaustion, the still present edge of fear, the complete absence of the performance he was so capable of when he was being the version of himself that ran a company, made him look younger than she'd seen him look since they were 22 and 23, and the world hadn't sorted itself into what it had become. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. Thank you." He shook his head slightly. "Don't." "I'm saying it anyway." "She's my daughter," he said. "You don't thank someone for—" He stopped. His voice had done something at the end of the sentence that he clearly hadn't planned for. He looked away at the corridor wall, and she let him look away. "I know," she said quietly. They went back into Lily, who was awake and asking for Gerald the rabbit with considerable urgency. Ethan drove back to Caldwell Cove in the early hours of the morning, retrieved Gerald from Lily's bedroom, and drove the 40 minutes back to Barton before 7 a.m. Lily was sitting up in bed when he came back, her color a little better already, the IV in her small arm, and the rabbit now tucked firmly under it. "You got him," she said. "I got him," Ethan said. "Did he have to stay in the car?" "He rode shotgun. He was very brave." Lily considered this, then nodded, accepting Gerald's bravery as appropriate. She looked at Ethan over Gerald's head. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. Claire in the chair by the window went still. Ethan pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. He looked at his daughter, at the IV tape on her small arm, the hospital bracelet with her name on it, the absolute directness of her face asking him an honest question the way she always did, without armor, without calculation. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to stay." Lily nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. She rearranged Gerald under her arm and looked at the ceiling. "Gerald is hungry," she announced. "He wants toast." "I'll find him some toast," Ethan said. "With butter," she said. "Not the jam. He doesn't like them mixed." Claire made a sound from the chair by the window. Not a laugh exactly. Something close to it. something that had been held tightly for a long time, releasing a fraction of its pressure. Ethan looked at her. She was looking back at him, and her eyes were wet, and she didn't look away. His father called on Sunday afternoon while Lily was sleeping and Claire had gone down to the cafeteria. Ethan picked up on the first ring. "I heard she was ill," Richard said. "Your assistant mentioned it." "She's better. We're taking her home tomorrow." "Good." A pause. "I'm glad she's better." Ethan leaned back in the chair. "Say what you called to say, Dad." "I called the board this morning," Richard said. "About Q4, without you." "I know. I got the summary." "They're nervous. There's talk that you're losing focus. Hargrove suggested that perhaps you need a leave of absence, which in board speak means, I know what it means in board speak." Ethan's voice didn't change. "Tell them I'll be on the call Tuesday. Tell them I've been handling a family matter and that it's being resolved, and that if Hargrove has concerns about my focus, he can bring them to me directly instead of talking to the rest of the room." Silence. "And after that?" Richard asked. "After that, I'm going to need some time," Ethan said. "I'm not leaving, but I'm also not going back to the way it was. Things are going to be different." Another long pause. "Different how?" Ethan thought about Lily asking him if he was going to stay. He thought about the 40-minute drive in the rain with both hands on the wheel. He thought about Claire's face in that hospital hallway and what it had taken for her to build what she'd built here, alone, for 4 years, and what it would take from him to be worth any of it. "Different in ways that aren't negotiable," he said. "I'll explain it when I'm ready, but I need you to understand right now, before anything else, Claire and Lily are not problems that get resolved. They are not situations that get managed. They are my family, and everything else comes after that. If the board has a problem with it, that's a conversation I'm willing to have, and I'm willing to have it very clearly." His father was quiet for long enough that Ethan thought he might have lost the signal. Then Richard Sterling said, "Your mother said something like that to me once. About you, actually, when you were about Lily's age." His voice was careful. "She said some things don't get scheduled. You just stop everything and show up." A pause. "I didn't listen well enough then either." It was as close to something as his father had ever come in Ethan's presence. He didn't push it further. He wasn't sure he could without something breaking that neither of them was prepared to repair in a hospital room in Barton, Maine, on a Sunday afternoon. "I'll be on the call Tuesday," Ethan said. "All right," his father said. "All right, son." He hung up and sat for a while in the quiet room with his daughter sleeping, one hand loosely holding Gerald, her breathing even and clear and steady. He stayed until Claire came back with 2 coffees from the cafeteria, and she handed him one without asking, and they sat on opposite sides of the hospital bed in the thin afternoon light, not talking, watching Lily sleep, and outside the window the rain had finally stopped. They brought Lily home on a Monday. She was still tired, the kind of bone-deep tired that lingers in children after a serious illness, making them quieter than usual, more inclined to sit in laps and watch things rather than participate in them. She rode home in the back seat with Gerald pressed to her face and didn't ask any questions about clouds, which was how Claire knew she wasn't fully herself yet. Lily always had questions about clouds. Ethan carried her inside. She let him, which was its own kind of milestone. She was a child who, in Claire's experience, had strong opinions about being carried and when it was acceptable, and the fact that she simply tucked her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes said something about where things stood between them now, something that had been established in a hospital room over a weekend and didn't need to be stated out loud. Claire watched him settle Lily on the couch with a blanket, and Gerald in the remote pointed at her favorite channel, and she watched his hands. The careful, deliberate way he tucked the blanket around her without making it too tight. The way he pushed the hair back from Lily's forehead with one finger before he stood up. Hands that signed 9-figure contracts. Hands that had spent a weekend learning how to be gentle with a sick 4-year-old. She went to make tea and stood in her kitchen for a minute with her palms flat on the counter, getting herself level. Things had shifted. She'd known it in the hospital, and she knew it now, and she was still working out how to hold it without either pulling toward it too fast or pushing it away from pure self-protection. Both reflexes were operating. They'd been operating since the night he walked in out of the storm. Ethan came into the kitchen and leaned in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "She's asleep already," he said. "She does that, crash sleeps when she's recovering." Claire put the kettle on. "You don't have to stay." I know. I mean it. She's home. She's fine. You've been sleeping in a hospital chair for 2 nights. 3, actually. The inn had the worst mattress I've ever encountered, and I couldn't sleep there either. She turned around. Ethan? I'll go, he said. I just... He stopped, looked at the floor for a second, then back at her. He had the look he sometimes got when he was choosing between the version of himself that managed everything smoothly and the version that said the actual thing. I want to say something, and I don't want you to respond to it right now. I just need you to hear it. Claire crossed her arms. Not defensively, more like bracing slightly. Okay. I'm not going back to the way things were, he said. Not at the company, not with my father, none of it. I know you didn't ask me to do that. I know you haven't asked me for anything except to not hurt Lily, and I understand why. But I want you to know that whatever comes next, whatever you decide is right for you and for her, I'm not going anywhere. That's not contingent on you giving me something in return. It's just the truth. The kettle started to heat. Claire didn't move. That's a big thing to say, she said. I know. People say big things when they're tired and scared and they've just been through something. They do, he agreed. And then some of those people still mean it afterward. He pushed off the doorway. I'll go. Let her sleep. Call me if she needs anything. He left. Claire stood in the kitchen and listened to the front door close and then the sound of his car, and then the ordinary quiet of her house, and then Lily's small breathing from the other room. She made her tea and she drank it standing at the counter, and she let herself carefully, like handling something fragile, begin to believe him. The call Ethan had promised the board came on Tuesday, and it was not a comfortable one. He took it from his room at Dot's Inn, sitting at the small desk by the window with his laptop open and his jacket on, and his face arranged into the particular expression that meant he was in the room, but also slightly above it. The CEO posture. The one that had taken years to develop and that still felt in private moments like wearing someone else's suit. Hargrove opened with figures. Hargrove always opened with figures because figures were a language in which he felt dominant, and he laid out 6 weeks of Ethan's reduced engagement in the form of delayed responses, missed calls, and what he called strategic drift at the executive level, as if it were a spreadsheet line item. Ethan let him finish. I hear the concern, Ethan said. Now let me tell you what I've decided. Hargrove started to speak. I'm going to finish, Ethan said pleasantly. I've been handling a significant personal matter. That matter is not resolved, but I have a clear picture of it now, and it's not going to impact operations. What is going to change is the company's direction in Q1 of next year, and I'd like to walk you through that before you make any decisions about my focus or my fitness for this role. He laid it out steadily. He'd been thinking about it in the margins of the last 3 weeks. In the early mornings on the dock, in the hospital chair, in the quiet spaces that opened up when you stepped out of the relentless machinery of a company and sat with people who had nothing to do with it. Sterling Technologies had grown fast and hard, and mostly correctly, and it had also, in that growth, drifted from the thing his grandfather had originally built, a company that made things people genuinely needed, in communities that felt the difference. The current model was correct on paper and hollow in practice, and Ethan had been dimly aware of that hollowness for 2 years and had kept moving too fast to do anything about it. He wasn't moving fast right now. He'd had time to look at it clearly. He proposed a community investment division. He proposed restructuring 2 dormant subsidiaries toward infrastructure work in underserved areas. He proposed bringing his father into a formal advisory capacity that would require Richard to use his connections in service of the new direction rather than the old one, which was either a brilliant reframe or an act of stubbornness dressed as strategy, and he wasn't entirely certain which. When he finished, there was a silence on the call. Then one of the quieter board members, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who had been on the board longer than anyone and who spoke infrequently and always precisely, said, I like it. It's the kind of thing we should have done 3 years ago. Hargrove objected. Hargrove had objections to everything that involved spending money on anything other than acquisition and margin. Ethan let him object and then addressed each one with the calm, methodical patience of someone who had done his homework and wasn't rattled by noise. By the end of the call, he had a preliminary yes from 6 of 9 board members and a promise from Reeves that she'd work on the remaining 3. He closed the laptop and sat back. Outside the window, Caldwell Cove was doing its ordinary late October thing. A fisherman moving down the main road with his gear, a dog sitting outside the hardware store waiting for someone inside. The water at the end of the street flat and gray under an overcast sky. He'd been here long enough now that he recognized the rhythms of it. The morning delivery truck, the retired couples who walked the waterfront at 9, the way the light changed on the cove when the clouds moved. He had not told Claire any of this yet. He needed to be careful about how he told her. She was wary of grand gestures, and rightly so. And there was a version of this story where a man upends his company's direction and points it toward something better and frames it as a romantic act, and she would see through that immediately and trust him less for it. The changes he was making were real, and they were theirs, his and the company's, and they had been building in him since before he walked into the blue door. But the timing made them look like they were about her, and he needed to be precise about that distinction. He went to the cafe at lunchtime. Lily was still resting at home under the supervision of a neighbor Claire trusted, and the cafe was in its midday quiet between breakfast and the afternoon coffee rush. Claire was restocking the pastry case, and she looked up when he came in. "How'd the call go?" she asked. "Better than expected." He sat at the counter. "I'm staying. Through the restructure at least, maybe longer." She set down the tray she was holding. "Staying where? Here? In Caldwell Cove? If that's... I'm not assuming anything about..." He caught himself. "I want to be here. I want to be wherever Lily is. If that's here, then I'm here." Claire looked at him steadily. "And the company runs itself while you're in coastal Maine?" "The company runs with the people I've hired to run it. I'll travel when I have to. I've been doing that remotely for 3 weeks, and it's worked." He paused. "I know it's not conventional." "Nothing about this is conventional." "No," he agreed, but conventional wasn't working for anyone. She picked up the tray again and slid the last of the pastries into the case and latched it. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't absence, but the presence of something being thought through. "Lily asked me this morning why you weren't at breakfast," she said. "What did you tell her?" "I said you had work to do." She straightened up. She said okay, and then she said she was saving you a piece of her toast. Ethan was quiet. "She'd already eaten it by the time she told me," Claire added. "She said Gerald was hungry, so it was an emergency." He laughed. It came out involuntarily, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere uncomplicated, and Claire's expression did something. A small, involuntary shift toward warmth that she didn't pull back in time, and then looked mildly annoyed at herself about, which made him like her so acutely that he had to look at the counter. "Come for dinner," she said. It came out like a decision being made out loud rather than an invitation that had been planned. "Tonight. Nothing complicated. I'm making whatever Lily will actually eat, which right now is pasta and approximately nothing else. But come." He looked up. "Yeah?" "Don't make it a thing," she said, reaching for a cloth to wipe down the counter. "It's pasta." "It's pasta," he agreed. "I'll be there." "What?" Richard Sterling arrived in Caldwell Cove on a Wednesday without calling first, which was so unlike him that when Ethan looked out the inn window and saw his father's car, the discreet black company sedan, driven by the same man who had driven Richard for 15 years, he stood at the glass for a long moment, just absorbing the strangeness of it. He went downstairs. His father was standing on the sidewalk in a coat that cost more than most of the cars parked on the street, looking at the water with his hands in his pockets, and he turned when Ethan came out. "I should have called," Richard said. "You should have." "I was concerned that if I called, you'd tell me not to come." "I probably would have." They looked at each other on the sidewalk, father and son, with the particular charged silence between them that had accumulated over decades of a relationship that was genuinely close and genuinely complicated, and had never entirely figured out how to be both those things at once, without one of them winning at the expense of the other. "Why are you here, Dad?" "I want to apologize to Claire." He said it without preamble, without building toward it. Richard Sterling, when he finally decided to do something, did it directly. It was probably the quality Ethan had inherited most completely. "In person, not through you, not with a letter. I want to look at her and say it." Ethan studied him. His father was 71, and he looked it this morning. looked tired in a way that wasn't physical, the tiredness of a man who had been sitting with something uncomfortable for long enough that it was starting to show on his face. It was the most honest Ethan had seen him look in years. "That's her choice," Ethan said. "I'll ask her. If she says no, you go home." "If she says no, I go home," Richard agreed. Ethan called Claire. She picked up on the second ring, and he told her plainly that his father was standing on the sidewalk in Caldwell Cove, and that he wanted to apologize to her in person, and that she was under no obligation whatsoever, and that he would send his father back to New York this minute if that was what she wanted. There was a long silence on the line. "He came all the way here," she said finally. "He did. Without calling. He was afraid I'd tell him not to." Another silence. "Give me an hour," she said. They met at the café after closing. Claire had sent Lily to the neighbors. She stood behind the counter when Richard came in, and she didn't offer her hand and she didn't smile, and Ethan stood to one side because this wasn't his to manage or mediate. Richard Sterling walked to the counter and he stopped, and he looked at the woman who had been 23 years old in his office and had not taken his money and had disappeared and raised his granddaughter alone for 4 years, and whatever he saw in her face, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of performance, seemed to settle something in him. "I did you a serious wrong," he said. "I told myself it was for my son's future, but that was—" He stopped. "That was a story I told myself, so I didn't have to acknowledge that I was simply removing something I found inconvenient. And you paid for that. Your daughter paid for it. And Ethan paid for it, even if he doesn't say so." He paused. "I'm sorry, I don't expect that to fix anything. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to hear it directly." Claire looked at him for a long time. "I know you're not a bad man," she said. "That's almost the harder thing. Bad men are easier to be angry at." She put her hand on the counter, not reaching toward him, just grounding herself. "I've raised Lily alone for 4 years. And she's healthy, and she's happy, and she's extraordinary, and some of that is her, and some of it is what I built here. I'm not going to tell you that what you did didn't matter. It did. It mattered enormously." She held his gaze. "But I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life defined by it. I have more important things to be." Richard nodded. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but a kind of recognition. He'd built a life on the assumption that strength meant control. What he was looking at across this counter was a different architecture entirely, and he was old enough and tired enough to see it clearly now. "Would you allow me to meet her?" he asked. "Lily, when you think it's appropriate, when she's ready. I understand if that's a long time from now." "We'll see," Claire said. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was the most honest answer available, and all 3 of them in that room knew it. Richard left the following morning, and the town went back to its ordinary rhythms, and November came in slowly off the water. Ethan had found a short-term rental, a small house 2 streets back from the water with a yard that needed attention and a kitchen that was functional if you didn't ask too much of it. He moved out of Dot's Inn on a Friday, and Dot told him he was welcome back any time and then said, unprompted, that she'd thought from day 3 that he was a man with a family situation, not a writer, and she was glad he was staying. He bought a coffee maker first, then basic groceries. Then, because the yard bothered him and he had excess energy that needed somewhere to go, a rake, and he spent a Saturday afternoon dealing with the yard while Lily sat on the back step supervising. "You missed some," she said. "I know, I'm getting to it. Gerald thinks you should start from the other end." Gerald's advice is noted. She jumped down from the step and grabbed the edges of a particularly large leaf pile he'd constructed and scattered it with focused violence. He turned around and looked at what remained of his 20 minutes of work. "Lily." "It was too tall," she said. "It was dangerous. It was a leaf pile. It was extremely tall." She picked up a leaf and examined it with great seriousness. "I want to jump in it when it's done. Then you have to help rebuild it." She looked at him. Then she put the leaf down and started dragging a pile toward him with both arms in the determined, inefficient way of a 4-year-old who had fully committed to a task. He watched her for a moment, this small person in her mismatched socks and her too big jacket, working with complete seriousness on a leaf pile in his backyard. He picked up the rake. "From the other end," she said, without looking up. From the other end, he said. Punked. The night he told Claire he loved her was not a night he had planned. It was 3 weeks into November, a Thursday, after one of the dinners that had become a quiet fixture of the week. Her cooking, his doing the dishes, Lily providing commentary on everything until she crashed at 8:30 with the absolute totality of a child who had used every available unit of energy. He had washed the last pan and was handing it to Claire to dry, which was their system. And she was telling him something about the cafe's winter menu, and he was listening. And then she said something that made her laugh at herself, self-deprecating and a little tired and completely real. And he looked at her in the kitchen light, and the sentence was just there. I love you, he said. She stopped. The pan was still in her hand. She looked at him. I know the timing is, he started. Ethan. I'm not asking you to say anything back. Ethan. She set the pan on the counter. She turned to face him fully. Her expression was doing several things at once, the old wariness, and something newer underneath it that was less defended. How long have you known that? He thought about it honestly. Longer than I've been here, he said. Maybe always. I don't know. I wasn't in a state to know it clearly before. That's a very careful answer. I'm trying to be precise. I know you are. She looked at him for a long moment. You broke my heart once. I know it wasn't by choice, but it happened, and I built myself back up, and I built this. She gestured, taking in the kitchen, the cafe beyond it, the whole life she'd constructed here. And it works. I'm not going to throw that over for a feeling. I'm not asking you to throw anything over. Then what are you asking? He leaned back against the counter. I'm asking you to let me keep showing up, he said. That's it. The same thing I've been doing. I just wanted you to know why. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the refrigerator cycled on and off in the silence. I know why, she said, finally, quietly. I've known for a while. She picked up the pan again, resuming the drying with the focused attention of someone doing a small specific thing while they thought through a larger one. I haven't let myself look at it directly. You don't have to. No, she agreed, but I think I want to. She put the pan away. She turned around and looked at him with the same direct, unarmored attention she'd had at 22 in a campus library, the version of her that had existed before the world required her to protect it more carefully. I'm not there yet. I need more time, but I'm closer than I was. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. She nodded. She picked up the dish towel and hung it over the oven handle, and she looked at him one more time with something in her expression that she didn't try to translate into words. A kind of acknowledgement, a settling, like a decision being recorded somewhere quietly. And then she said she was going to check on Lily, and she left the kitchen. Ethan stood at the counter in the warmth and the quiet and thought about his grandfather, who had built the first Sterling company from nothing, who had told a young Richard once that the only thing worth building was something that outlasted your best excuse for why you couldn't, and thought that the old man would have understood something about what this kitchen felt like tonight. Not finished, not resolved, but real and moving forward, and built by two people who had both earned, the hard way, the right to be careful about it. He turned off the kitchen light and went to look in on Lily, who was asleep on her back with Gerald face down on her chest, and he stood in the doorway for a minute in the strip of light from the hallway, and he let himself have it, all of it, without reservation, without managing it, the weight and the gratitude and the strangeness of a life that looked nothing like anything he'd planned, and everything like something he hadn't known he needed. Then he went home through the November dark, and behind him the lights of the Blue Door Café were the last thing to go out on the street. Winter came to Caldwell Cove the way it always did, without asking permission, settling in gradually, until one morning you looked out the window and the cove was steel gray, and the boats had been pulled and the tourists were gone, and the town was just itself again, the people who had chosen it or been born into it or arrived in a storm and never quite left. Ethan was in that last category. He'd stopped counting weeks sometime in December. It had simply become where he lived. The Community Investment Division had its first official meeting in January, conducted over video from the small house 2 streets back from the water, with Patricia Reeves on one screen and the newly hired division director on another, and 3 municipal contacts from a mid-sized city in Ohio, that had agreed to pilot the infrastructure program. It ran 90 minutes. It was productive without being dramatic. And when it was over, Ethan closed the laptop and went to pick up Lily from her afternoon session at the small art program the community center ran on Wednesdays. She came out carrying a painting she was very serious about. It was primarily blue, with what appeared to be a yellow circle in the upper left corner and several vertical shapes that she explained at length were trees, but that she had decided to paint the way they felt rather than the way they looked. "That's a real artistic principle," Ethan told her, buckling her into the back seat. "I know," she said. "Miss Hendricks said so too." "Did she?" "She said I have an instinct." Lily examined the painting with the critical eye of an artist assessing her own work. "Gerald also has an instinct, but he mainly instincts about toast." Ethan kept his face straight until he was in the front seat and couldn't be seen. These were the hours he hadn't known to want. He hadn't known before this what it felt like to be the person who picked a child up from somewhere. The physical fact of it, standing outside a door waiting, the child appearing with something she'd made, the car ride home with her talking without pause about everything she'd noticed and thought and decided since he'd last seen her. It was ordinary. It was also, in a way he couldn't have articulated to the board or to anyone who measured value in the currency he'd spent his career accumulating, the most substantial thing he did on any given day. Claire was at the cafe when they got back, finishing the closing count. Lily ran in and presented the painting with the formality of a diplomat delivering a treaty. Claire received it with appropriate gravity, asked 3 specific questions about the trees and the yellow circle, and taped it to the wall behind the register next to the other paintings, which now formed a running gallery of Lily's winter production. Ethan sat at the counter and watched the two of them, and felt, without trying to name it too precisely, that this was what the word home was supposed to mean. Bet. He asked Claire to marry him in March, on Lily's 5th birthday. Not with fanfare. Not with a restaurant and a ring and a champagne glass and an audience. He'd thought about it long enough to know that any version of this that looked like a performance would be wrong. Wrong for her. Wrong for what they'd actually built. Wrong in the way that grand gestures are wrong when the real thing has been happening quietly for months and doesn't need a spotlight. It was after the birthday party. A small, chaotic affair at the cafe involving 7 5-year-olds. A cake with a rabbit on it that Lily had designed herself and that bore, in Ethan's estimation, a genuinely impressive likeness of Gerald, and a piñata situation that got away from everyone involved. After the last child had been collected, after the streamers were down and the cake plates were stacked and Lily was asleep on the couch in the back room with Gerald and a balloon tied to her wrist, he and Claire sat at the counter in the quiet cafe with the last of the coffee and the particular exhaustion of people who had just successfully managed 7 5-year-olds. "That piñata was a structural failure," Claire said. "I tried to tell you." "You said it seemed sturdy." "I said it seemed sturdy for a piñata, which is not a category known for structural integrity." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "She had a good day." "She had a great day." Claire smiled at the counter. "She keeps saying it's her best birthday. She says this every birthday, but she seems more specific about it this time." "She told me this morning that turning 5 is serious business," Ethan said. "She had a whole position on it." "She has a position on everything." "She does." He set the mug down. He looked at Claire. She had a smear of blue frosting on her left forearm that she hadn't noticed, and her hair had mostly escaped whatever she'd put it up in for the party, and she was tired in a good way. The way you're tired after something went well. She looked, to him, like the most real person in any room she was in, always. "I want to marry you," he said. He said it the same way he'd said he loved her. Not as a performance, just as a fact being stated because it was true, and she deserved to hear it clearly. "I'm not asking because Lily had a birthday, or because the company's doing well, or because I've been here 5 months, and it seems like the next step. I'm asking because I want to build the rest of my life with you specifically, and I've known that for a long time, and I didn't want to wait until some moment that felt more officially appropriate because I'm not sure that moment exists, and I don't want to keep waiting for it." Claire looked at him. She was quiet for long enough that the cafe settled around them. The old building's familiar sounds, the slight creak of the sign outside, the hum of the refrigeration unit. "You don't have a ring," she said. I didn't want to presume. That's very measured of you. I can get a ring, he said. I know someone who owns several. She laughed. It was a real one. Not the carefully managed near smile of the early weeks, but the unguarded version, the one that reached her eyes, the one she'd stopped trying to keep from him sometime around December. She shook her head slightly, looking at the counter, and he waited. Yes, she said. Not a dramatic yes, not a tearful yes, just the word, stated plainly, with the same directness she brought to everything. I'm closer than I was, she'd said in November, and she'd meant it, and she had arrived here on her own terms, in her own time, and that was the only way it could have worked. Yes, I want that too. He reached across the counter and took her hand. She turned it over and held his. In the back room, Lily slept with her balloon and her rabbit and a stomach full of cake, 5 years old and completely unaware that the shape of her family was being decided quietly at the counter of the cafe where her life had first been complicated and then, slowly, made whole. The wedding was small, in June, on the dock at the end of the main road. It was the kind of event that the residents of Caldwell Cove would have considered appropriately scaled. Not a statement, not a destination event, just a gathering of people who mattered on a Wednesday afternoon. Because Wednesday was when Claire could close the cafe without losing the weekend revenue she depended on, and the practical consideration seemed to both of them more honest than the romantic one anyway. Dot was there. Maya, who had grown into more than a part-time helper and was now managing the cafe's weekend shifts, was there. Patricia Reeves flew up from New York. A handful of friends who had tracked Claire down over the years and stuck. Women who had been her lifeline through the hard stretches, who knew what the hard stretches had cost, and were there to see this. Richard Sterling was there too. He had not met Lily until February, 3 months after his visit to the cafe. Claire had decided the timing herself, without input from Ethan, and she had prepared Lily with the matter-of-fact simplicity she brought to all of Lily's harder questions. This was Daddy's father, which made him a grandfather, and he had made some mistakes a long time ago, and he was trying to do better, which was something people did sometimes, and Lily could decide how she felt about him. Lily had decided in roughly 11 minutes that he was acceptable. She had shown him Gerald and explained Gerald's full history, and Richard Sterling, who had not held a child in years and who was clearly unsure where to put his hands, had listened to every word with the focused attention of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that the most important meeting he would ever attend was happening in a small cafe on the Maine coast, and the other party was 5 years old. He had cried, after, in the car. Ethan knew this because the driver had told him quietly, and Ethan had not said anything about it to his father because some things were better left as private accountings. At the wedding, Richard sat next to Dot, and they got along well, which surprised no one more than Richard, who had not in recent memory sat next to someone who knew nothing about him and cared less and simply talked to him like a person. Dot told him about the inn and about Caldwell Cove, and about the family that had left and the families that had stayed, and he listened, and somewhere between the ceremony and the dinner, he became, temporarily, just a 71-year-old man at a wedding instead of the architect of other people's futures. Lily was the flower girl. She took this role with the complete seriousness it deserved, walking the length of the dock with a focused dignity that lasted approximately 40 seconds before she spotted something interesting in the water and had to be redirected. She made it. Gerald was tucked under her arm for the ceremony because she had argued persuasively that he was family. Ethan stood at the end of the dock and watched Claire come toward him in the June afternoon light. She was wearing something simple, the color of the sea on a clear day, and she walked without hesitation. And she looked at him the whole way, and what he saw in her face was not the performed emotion of a wedding, but the real version. Complex and a little tired and entirely certain in the way that certainty looks when it's been tested and held. He had not planned what he was going to say. He decided, after several attempts, that planning it would make it worse. So he said what was true, that she was the most honest person he knew, and that honesty had cost her things. It shouldn't have, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life being worth the risk she was taking right now. She said that she hadn't expected any of it. Not the storm, not the cafe, not him standing in her doorway dripping on her welcome mat, Not Lily walking straight up to a stranger with a question that cracked 5 years of silence open, and that she'd spent a long time being afraid of wanting things she might lose, and that somewhere between the hospital in Barton and a November kitchen and a leaf pile that kept getting destroyed, she'd stopped being more afraid of wanting it than of missing it. Lily, from her position as primary witness, said, "Finally," in the tone of a person who had been waiting for the adults to get there and was relieved it was over. Everyone laughed, even Richard. The Bennett Sterling Foundation held its first event 18 months later, a Saturday morning in October, in a converted warehouse space in a neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, that the Community Investment Division had spent 14 months working alongside. It wasn't a gala. It was a free program for kids between the ages of 4 and 12, art supplies, books, 2 reading corners with good light and decent chairs, and 2 rooms outfitted for building and making things, because both Ethan and Claire had argued for the building rooms against the initial plan to use the space only for literacy, and they had won that argument on the grounds that children who are allowed to make things learn to believe they can. Lily was 6 by then. She attended the opening in a supervisory capacity, walking through the building rooms with her hands clasped behind her back and a critical eye, pointing out things that could be better and things that were correct. She had recently determined that she wanted to be an architect, which had lasted 3 weeks before she revised to marine biologist, which had lasted 2 weeks before she landed on probably someone who tells other people if they're doing things right or wrong, which Ethan privately thought was both accurate and a reasonable career aspiration. She stopped in the middle of the largest room, the main art space with good northern light coming in through windows that had been added at Claire's insistence, and turned to her father with the full gravity of her assessment. "It's good," she said. "It needs more blue." "We can add more blue," he said. "Gerald thinks so too." Gerald was not present, being a home rabbit now, in Claire's firm opinion, but his advisory influence clearly extended to community development initiatives. "We'll get more blue," Ethan told her, and he meant it, and they did. Claire stood at the window of the main room and watched children she didn't know move through the space with the particular quality of children who have been given permission. Permission to touch things, and make noise, and build something wrong, and start over. And she felt something settle in her that had been in motion for a long time. Not a resolution exactly, more like an arrival, the feeling that something had been brought to where it was supposed to go. She had not set out to build a foundation, she had set out to survive, and then to build a cafe, and then to raise a daughter well, and then, one storm-driven night, to not fall apart when the past walked in dripping on her welcome mat. Every next thing had grown out of the thing before it, without a master plan, without the kind of clean intention that made for good press releases but rarely reflected how actual lives moved. This was the actual version, imperfect and specific and built from what was available at each moment, including the painful moments, maybe especially those. Ethan came to stand next to her. He had their son on his hip, James, 14 months old, presently engaged in trying to remove Ethan's collar in a sustained and focused way that Lily had told him, with authority, was a phase. James had Claire's coloring and Ethan's expression of intense focus while doing something that was objectively not important, and he brought a quality of cheerful, destructive energy to every environment he entered. "She's declared we need more blue," Ethan said. "She's right," Claire said, without turning from the window. "The east wall needs something." "I said we'd get more blue." "Good." She leaned slightly into him without looking away from the room. James reached for her hair, and she let him take it, untangling it from his fist with the patient, automatic efficiency of a mother who has done this 10,000 times. "It's good, Ethan." "It is," he said. "Not finished." "No, but good." They stood there for a while watching it, the room filling with children and sound and the specific productive chaos of a space being used for what it was made for. Lily moved through it all with her hands clasped behind her back, pausing to offer commentary to a boy who was building something out of cardboard that was structurally questionable, demonstrating to him, with complete confidence, a better approach. The boy looked skeptical. Lily showed him anyway. After a moment he tried it, and it held. and he looked up at Lily with the expression of someone who has been proven wrong and is not sure whether to be annoyed or grateful. Lily was already moving on to the next thing. That was the child. That had always been the child, from the moment she walked across a cafe floor to a stranger and asked him a question that changed 3 lives. She had done it without armor, without calculation, with the pure instinct of a person who hasn't yet learned to protect themselves from wanting things, who still operates on the original belief that the answer might be yes. Some people lost that as they grew. Lily, Claire suspected, was not going to be one of them. Bolcha. There is a particular kind of story that our culture loves to tell about love and loss and reunion. The version where everything clicks back into place, where the wounds close clean, where the years of absence become prologue to a perfect present. People consume those stories because they are comforting, because they suggest that enough time and enough love can make everything smooth. This wasn't that story. What Claire and Ethan built was not smooth. It was the result of 2 people who had each been shaped by absence. Hers, the grinding daily absence of doing it alone. His, the absence of something he hadn't known was missing until a 4-year-old walked up to him in a cafe and made it undeniable. And who chose, against the reasonable caution that experience teaches, to build something anyway. Not because the past was resolved, because you cannot wait for the past to fully resolve. It doesn't work that way. You carry it forward, and you do the next thing, and the thing after that, and the building is what heals it, not the waiting. Richard Sterling spent his last years differently than his earlier ones. He stayed connected to the foundation, not in a governing capacity, but in the way a person stays connected when they understand they are repaying a debt that can't be fully repaid, showing up, being useful, keeping his opinions calibrated to what was actually asked of him, which was a significant adjustment, and one he did not always manage perfectly. He and Claire never became easy with each other, but they became honest, which was more durable than easy and considerably harder to achieve. He met James for the first time when the boy was 3 weeks old, and he held him with the confidence he had never had with Lily and the tenderness he was still learning, and he looked at Ethan over the child's head with an expression Ethan had never seen on his father's face before. Gratitude without an agenda, uncomplicated and unmanaged. "He has your grandfather's ears," Richard said. "I know," Ethan said. "I hope that's the only thing." Richard almost smiled. "Your grandfather was a good man." "He was," Ethan agreed. "He built things that lasted." They understood each other in that moment, in the way that men who have been shaped by the same flawed blueprint understand each other when they finally stop arguing about the blueprint. On the 5th anniversary of the night, Ethan walked into the blue door. An October evening, the same raw end-of-season feel in the air, the water doing the same flat gray thing it did every autumn. Claire locked up the cafe at close and found Ethan waiting on the steps. She had not planned anything. He had not planned anything. It was a weeknight, and Lily was at a sleepover, and James was at Dot's, who had appointed herself unofficial grandmother to both children with the decisive efficiency she brought to everything. And the evening was simply open in the way evenings rarely are when you have young children and a business and a company undergoing structural transformation. "Walk?" he said. "Walk," she said. They went down to the water. Not the dock. That was for events, for the wedding, for the ceremonial moments. They went to the stretch of public beach that ran north of the main road, the rocky kind that wasn't good for swimming, but that was good for walking. The stones shifting under your feet, the water at your left, the town lights behind you getting smaller. They walked without a destination and without much conversation, which was the particular ease of 2 people who have shared enough silence that silence doesn't need filling. The wind came off the water, and it was cold and tasted of salt and the season that was ending, and Claire put her hands in her pockets and Ethan walked close enough that their arms touched. 5 years, she said. "From about this time of night," he said. "I was wetter. You were very wet. The jacket never recovered." She laughed. "The wind took it." They walked a little further. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. Not a loaded question. A real one, the kind you can only ask someone after enough time has made it safe to hear a complicated answer. He thought about it. He thought about the board and the restructure and the house, 2 streets from the water and the leaf pile that kept getting destroyed, and the hospital drive and his father's face above an infant and Lily's painting on the cafe wall, the trees as they felt rather than as they looked. I regret the years I didn't know about her, he said. That's not going away. I don't think it should. He paused. But the rest of it? How it happened, what it cost, all the things that had to break before we ended up here? No. I don't think I get to regret the path when I'm standing at the place it led. Claire nodded. The stone shifted under her next step, and his hand came out automatically to steady her, and she took it and kept it, and they walked that way. Her hand in his, the water beside them doing what water does, moving, constant, indifferent to the small human dramas at its edge, and also somehow the right backdrop for all of them. I used to think the point was to get somewhere, she said after a while. Some finished place, where everything was resolved and you could stop. And now? She looked at the water. Now I think the point is what you decide to do with what you've been given, including the hard parts, especially the hard parts. She was quiet for a moment. Lily is who she is because of all of it. The years I raised her alone, the things that made me build something here. She grew up watching someone rebuild, and she learned from it. I didn't plan that, but it's the most real thing I've ever given her. Ethan thought about his daughter walking through a Cleveland art room with her hands clasped behind her back, telling a boy with skeptical eyes that his cardboard structure would hold better if he tried it differently. The absolute certainty of her, the willingness to show up and engage, to walk across a room toward a stranger, to ask the direct question without armor. She had learned that somewhere. She had been that way from the beginning, but she had also watched her mother build a life out of what was available, watched her hold steady through the hard parts, watched her choose, slowly, carefully, but without apology, to let someone back in when the evidence warranted it. Children absorbed what was demonstrated. They learned what they lived around. She's going to be something, Ethan said. She already is, Claire said. She already has been. They turned back at the rocks where the beach ended, retracing the walk, the town lights growing ahead of them. Somewhere in one of those lit windows, someone was doing something ordinary, making dinner, watching something on television, putting a child to bed. The ordinary machinery of life proceeding without drama, which was, in the end, what all the dramatic parts were in service of. The chance to have ordinary evenings that felt like enough. Claire leaned her head briefly against his shoulder as they walked, and he adjusted his stride to match hers, and they came back to the cafe that way. Together, unhurried, walking home through the October dark in a town they had each arrived in by accident and stayed in by choice, which was maybe the most honest definition of belonging that either of them had ever found. The sign above the door moved in the wind. The Blue Door Café. The paint on the letters had been touched up twice since that first night, and it still wasn't perfect, and it still said exactly what it needed to say. Claire took out her keys. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." "I thought you just closed," he said. "I'm the owner," she said. "I can make an exception." He followed her inside, and the door swung shut behind them, and the light came on in the window, warm and steady, the way it always had.